Good morning, Super Scholars! I hope everyone had a fantastic weekend and that we were all social distancing, staying away from each other, even though I know it was a fun holiday. Hopefully, we can work that out so that we can be back together again soon because I know that I am missing you all terribly. So, today we're going to continue reading Holes. I'm working on reading lessons. Y'all know, even for Miss Gross, sometimes when I'm reading to y'all, I talk really fast and I get flubbed up on some words. Is that okay? Hopefully you're telling me yes. Okay, it's okay if you're struggling as you're reading through this because we're not always perfect. Okay, but as long as you're using the strategies that you've learned to sound out some of the words you might not know or look up things that you don't understand when you're looking at vocabulary, because as we know, there are a lot of the words in this book that we may not be familiar with. So make sure that you're going back and looking at those words if you're seeing something that you're not familiar with or you don't know exactly what it means. Make sure that you're using those resources to find it out so that you can make sense of the book, because sometimes the words aren't necessarily important to the meaning of the book, but sometimes they are. Sometimes they make that big difference. So if you're not sure of what you're reading in some of these, make sure that you're looking it up, or you're coming to our office hours at 1 o'clock and asking one of the teachers, hey, I saw this word in my book. What does it mean? Okay, so make sure that you're using those resources that you have. Today we're reading chapters 17 through 20. As usual, I'm going to read some of it with you, and I'm going to leave some of it for you to read on your own as well. Today we're going to be focusing on the plot elements of it. And remember with the plot, we said that the plot was the events in the story. Okay, so we're focusing on what's happening in the story now. Some of you might not have got to start your plot diagram on Friday, and that's okay because I know there was a Go Formative to go along with it as well. But today, we want to make sure that you're getting that done. In the pacing guide, it said for you to just draw it, and that's perfectly fine if you did. That was the plan. I am also linking in a digital version of the plot diagram. If you want to do the digital version instead of having to take a picture of your paper copy, you can, or you can just take a picture of your paper copy, whichever is the easiest for you, okay? Because I know that some of us like to do it in different ways. So today our learning target is I'm learning to describe in depth, so that means in detail, okay? Not just saying one word, the events in a story. So using all of those details building up to it and what is happening. Today, you'll know you have it, you know you're successful when you can complete the rising action of the story. Okay, so I went ahead and drew out a little plot diagram here. I'm going to hold it up close so you can see it. So remember the plot diagram? It looks kind of like a roller coaster. It starts off with the exposition. And that was what we were working on Friday. Some of you might not have done that yet. The exposition is the characters, the setting, it's the intro to the story, what has happened. So you can go ahead and fill that out if you haven't already done so. Okay, that's the build up to the story. All of those things have already introduced us. That's what you would write under exposition. Then rising action, which is what we're doing today, that's when things are starting to heat up. Okay, that's when things are starting to get serious, what you're reading about now. Okay, we haven't had our huge climax yet. We don't know what the main problem in the story is. We know Stanley's at camp, he's stolen something, he's gotten in trouble, and he's having a really hard time. We know these things. We don't know what that main big break in the story is going to be yet. We don't know what the climax is, okay? But you don't want to be there yet. So far, you're just writing down what's happened so far. What's our buildup? Like we talked about at school, it's like Jaws in the movie, you know. They introduce you to all the characters. They tell you that there's this shark in the water. That's the exposition, okay? The rising action is when you hear that music, dun, 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 and then the climax is Jaws jumping out of the water, okay? We don't have our climax yet, but we do have those rising actions, and that's what you're going to write down today, okay? So I'm going to go ahead and start reading. As I'm reading, I want for you all to be thinking, how is Stanley feeling at this point in the book? He's let X-Ray take the credit for the thing that he's found, the lipstick tube. They've all been digging. So, how is he feeling? How would you feel if you were in Stanley's shoes at this point? We're reading chapter 17. It's on page 77. I'm going to give you a minute to get there. All right, I'm going to go ahead and start reading. If you're not there yet, just pause me and you can hit play when you're ready, okay? For the next week and a half, the boys continued to dig in and around the area where X-Ray had supposedly found the gold tube. They widened X-Ray's hole, as well as the holes Armpit and Squid had been digging, until the fourth day, when all three holes met and formed one big hole. As the days wore on, the warden became less and less patient. She arrived later in the morning and left earlier in the afternoon. Meanwhile, the boys continued to dig later and later. "This is no bigger than it was when I left you yesterday," she said after arriving late one morning, well after sunrise. "What have you been doing down there?" "Nothing," said Squid. It was the wrong thing to say. At just that moment, Armpit was returning from bathroom break. "How nice of you to join us," she said. "And what have you been doing?" "I had to, go." The warden jabbed at Armpit with her pitchfork, knocking him backward into the big hole. The pitchfork left 3 holes in the front of his shirt and 3 tiny spots of blood. "You're giving these boys too much water," said the warden to Mr. Pendenski. They continued to dig until late afternoon, long after all the other groups had finished for the day. Stanley was down in the big hole, along with the other 6 boys. They had stopped using the wheelbarrows. He dug his shovel into the side of the hole. He scooped up some dirt and was raising it up to the surface when Zigzag's shovel caught him in the side of the head. He collapsed. He wasn't sure if he'd passed out or not. He looked up to see Zigzag's wild head staring down at him. "I ain't digging that dirt up," Zigzag said. "That's your dirt." "Hey, Mom!" Magnet called. "Caveman's been hurt." Stanley brought his fingers up to the side of his neck. He fed his wet blood and pretty big gash just below his ear. Magnet helped Stanley to his feet, then up and out of the hole. Mr. Sir made a bandage out of a piece of his sack of sunflower seeds and taped it over Stanley's wound. Then he told him to get back to work. It isn't nap time. When Stanley returned to the hole, Zigzag was waiting for him. "That's your dirt," Zigzag said. "You have to dig it up. It's covering up my dirt." Stanley felt a little dizzy. He could see a small pile of dirt. It took him a moment to realize that the dirt was Sorry, words are hard. Took him a moment to realize that it was the dirt which had been on his shovel when he was hit. He scooped it up, and then Zigzag dug his shovel back into the ground underneath where Stanley's dirt had been. If you were Stanley and you had just been hit across the head with a shovel to the point where you're bleeding, how do you think that you would be feeling? I personally think that I would probably be pretty aggravated that I have to go back to work, start digging these holes, even after I just got hurt. And especially for someone who I think is a friend to treat me that way. Doesn't sound like Stanley's having the best experience at camp. The next morning, Mr. Sir marched the boys to another section of the lake, and each boy dug his own hole, 5 feet deep and 5 feet wide. Stanley was glad to be away from the big hole. At least now he knew how much he had to dig for the day, and it was a relief not to have other shovels swinging past his face, or the warden hanging around. He dug his shovel into the dirt, then slowly turned to the dump it into the pile. He had to make his turns smooth and slow. If he jerked too quickly, he felt a throbbing pain just above his neck where Zigzag's shovel had hit him. That part of his head, between his neck and ear, was considerably swollen. There were no mirrors in camp, but he imagined he looked like he had a hard-boiled egg sticking out of him. The remainder of his body hardly hurt at all. His muscles had strengthened, and his hands were tough and calloused. He was still the slowest digger, but not all that much slower than Magnet. Less than 30 minutes after Magnet returned to camp, Stanley spat into his hole. After his shower, he put his dirty clothes in the crate and got out his box of stationery. When he stayed in the tent to write a letter to Squid, and the other boys wouldn't make fun of him for writing to his mother. Dear Mom and Dad, camp is hard, but challenging. We've been running obstacle courses and have to swim long distances on the lake. Tomorrow we learn. What is Stanley talking about? He is not swimming in the lake. Why do you think his letter is starting off this way? He stopped writing as Zero walked into the tent, then returned to his letter. He didn't care what Zero thought. Zero was nobody. To rock climb. I know that sounds scary, but don't worry. Zero was standing beside him now, watching him write. Stanley turned and felt his neck throb. I don't like it when you read over my shoulder, okay? Zero said nothing. I'll be careful. It's not all fun and games here, but I think I'm getting a lot out of it. It builds character. The other boys, I don't know how, said Zero. What? Can you teach me? Stanley didn't know what he was talking about. Teach you to what? To rock climb? Zero stared at him with penetrating eyes. What? Said Stanley. He was hot, tired, and sore. I want to learn to read and write, said Zero. Stanley let out a short laugh. He wasn't laughing at Zero. He was just surprised. All this time he had thought Zero was reading over his shoulder. Sorry, he said. I don't know how to teach. After digging all day, he didn't have the strength to try to teach Zero to read and write. He needed to save his energy for the people who counted. You don't have to teach me how to write, said Zero. Just to read. I don't have anybody to write to. Sorry, Stanley said again. His muscles and hands weren't the only parts of his body that had toughened over the past several weeks. His heart had hardened as well. He finished his letter. He barely had enough moisture in his mouth to seal the stamp on the envelope. It seemed that no matter how much water he drank, he was always thirsty. I don't know about y'all, but my heart just ripped out of my chest with poor little Zero saying he doesn't have anyone to write to. Some of you have heard the story of me before. Those of you that are in my class have, and in my reading groups have, but other fourth graders might not. When I was younger, I didn't know how to read or write. I made it all the way to the second grade, and I tried to fake my way through reading. I would memorize the stories and then read it back, and nobody ever knew. And when I was younger, I wrote a letter saying that the only thing I wanted for Christmas was to be able to read and write. So I really understand where Zero's coming from in wanting this feeling, and I think some of you might feel the same way as well. That your school is important, and reading and writing is very important to you so that you can communicate with other people. And it really hurts my heart that Zero doesn't have anybody to write to and that he doesn't have any family out there, because that's really hard for him, I think. And I think it's really sad that Stanley is having to say his heart has hardened. What does it mean when he says his heart has hardened? What do you think that means he's feeling inside? Or how he used to be feeling, maybe? I'm going to read one last chapter to you, chapter 19, and then I'm going to set you free to read the last chapter on your own and work on your plot diagram. So I'll read this last one, and then we'll go off on our own, okay? He was awakened one night by a strange voice. At first, he thought it might have been some kind of animal, and it frightened him. But as the sleep cleared from his head, he realized the noise was coming from the cot next to him. Squid was crying. "Are you okay?" Stanley whispered. Squid's head jerked around. He sniffed and caught his breath. "Yeah, I'm fine," he whispered and sniffled again. In the morning, Stanley asked Squid if he was feeling better. "What are you, my mother?" asked Squid. Stanley raised and lowered one shoulder. "I got allergies, okay?" Squid said. "Okay," said Stanley. "You open your mouth again and I'll break your jaw." Stanley kept his mouth shut for most of the time. He didn't talk too much to any of the boys, afraid that he might say something wrong. They called him caveman and all that, but he couldn't forget that they were dangerous too. They were all here for a reason. As Mr. Sir would say, this ain't a Girl Scout camp. Stanley was thankful there were no racial problems. X-Ray, Armpit, and Zero were black. He, Squid, and Zigzag were white. Magnet was Hispanic. On the lake, they were all the same reddish-brown color, the color of dirt. He looked up from his hole to see the water truck and its trailing dust cloud. His canteen was still almost a quarter full. He quickly drank it down, then took his place in line, behind Magnet and in front of Zero. The air was thick with heat, dust, and exhaust fumes. Mr. Sir filled their canteens. The truck pulled away. Stanley was back in his hole, shovel in hand, when he heard Magnet call out, "Anybody want some sunflower seeds?" Magnet was standing at ground level, holding a sack of seeds. He popped a handful of seeds in his mouth, chewed and swallowed, shells and all. "Over here!" called X-Ray. The sack looked to be about half full. Magnet rolled up the top and tossed it to X-Ray. "How'd you get them without Mr. Sir seeing you?" asked Armpit. "Can't help it," Magnet said. He held up both hands, wiggled his fingers, and laughed. "My fingers are like little magnets." The sack went from X-Ray to Armpit to Squid. "It's sure good to eat something that doesn't come from a can," said Armpit. Squid tossed the sack to Zigzag. Stanley knew it would come to him next. He didn't even want it. From the moment Magnet shouted, "Anybody want some sunflower seeds?" he knew there would be trouble. Mr. Sir was sure to come back, and anyway, the salted shells would only make him thirsty. "Coming your way, caveman," said Zigzag. "Airmail and special delivery." It's unclear whether the seeds spilled before they got to Stanley or after he dropped the bag. It seemed that Zigzag hadn't rolled the top before throwing it, and that was the reason he didn't catch it. But it all happened very fast. One moment, the sack was flying through the air. The next thing Stanley knew, the sack was in his hole, and the seeds were spilled across the dirt. "Oh, man!" said Magnet. "Sorry," Stanley said as he tried to sweep the seeds back into the sack. "I don't want to eat dirt," said X-Ray. Stanley didn't know what to do. "The truck's coming!" shouted Zigzag. Stanley looked at the approaching dust cloud, then back down at the spilled seeds. He was in the wrong place at the wrong time. Sounds like that's happening again for Stanley. What else is new? He dug his shovel into the hole and tried to turn over the dirt and bury the seeds. What he should have done, he realized later, was knock one of his dirt piles back into his hole. But the idea of putting dirt into his hole was unthinkable. "Hello, Mr. Sir," said X-Ray. "Back so soon?" "It seems like you were just here," said Armpit. "Time flies when you're having fun," said Magnet. Stanley continued to turn the dirt over in his hole. "You Girl Scouts having a good time?" asked Mr. Sir. He moved from one hole to another, kicked the dirt pile by Magnet's hole, then moved towards Stanley. Stanley could see 2 seeds at the bottom of his hole. As he tried to cover them up, he unearthed a corner of the sack. "Well, what do you know, caveman?" said Mr. Sir, standing over him. "Looks like you found something." Stanley didn't know what to do. Dig it out, Mr. Sir said. We'll take it to the warden. Maybe she'll give you the rest of the day off. It's not anything, Stanley muttered. Let me be the judge of that, said Mr. Sir. Stanley reached down and pulled up the empty burlap sack. He tried to hand it to Mr. Sir, but he wouldn't take it. So tell me, caveman, said Mr. Sir, how did my sack of sunflower seeds get in your hole? I stole it from your truck. You did? Yes, Mr. Sir. What happened to all the sunflower seeds? I ate them. By yourself? Yes, Mr. Sir. Hey, caveman, shouted Armpit. How come you didn't share any with us? That's cold, man, said X-Ray. I thought you were our friend, said Magnet. Mr. Sir looked around from one boy to the other, then back to Stanley. We'll see what the warden has to say about this. Let's go. Stanley climbed up and out of the hole and followed Mr. Sir to the truck. He still held the empty sack. It felt good to sit inside the truck, out of the direct rays of the sun. Stanley was surprised he could feel good about anything at the moment, but he did. It felt good to sit down on a comfortable seat for a change. And as the truck bounced along the dirt, he was able to appreciate the air blowing through the open window onto his hot and sweaty face. Why do you think Stanley took the rap? Would you have? Or would you have ratted out Magnet for taking them? I don't know. I think that Stanley was having a hard time deciding whether he wanted to remain cool and safe around the other boys or take his punishment for the sunflower seeds. We'll see what happens as we continue to read. Make sure that you're filling out your exposition, your setting, the characters, all the things they've introduced to us so far, and the rising action. What has happened in the story to help it heat up? And that you don't necessarily have to say Stanley got in trouble and he got sent to camp, because that would have been in the introduction of the book. Okay? What is happening now that's making things get a little more exciting, or that's building relationships between characters? Okay, I want for you to work on that today. If you have questions, please come to our office hours at 1 o'clock and talk to me about them. Okay, again, I'm going to post a digital version of the plot diagram, but if you would like to write it down on your piece of paper and just draw it and take a picture, that's perfectly fine too. But you have to make sure that you're doing at least one of them so that you can get credit for participating today. Okay? Have a great afternoon, Super Scholars!